In 1856, the small farming community of Whitmore County, Virginia, existed in a delicate balance between the antebellum traditions of the Old South and the growing tensions that would soon tear the nation apart. It was here, along a dusty road bordered by tobacco fields and ancient oak trees, that the Ashford plantation stood like a monument to a dying way of life. The main house, a modest two-story structure with peeling white paint and sagging shutters, overlooked 300 acres of rolling hills where cotton and corn grew in neat rows under the watchful eyes of 23 enslaved individuals. Margaret Ashford had been mistress of this domain for barely 2 years when her husband, Colonel James Ashford, succumbed to consumption in the winter of 1854. At 28 years of age, she found herself alone with responsibilities that would have challenged men twice her age. The neighbors whispered that she was too young, too delicate, too inexperienced to manage such an operation. They whispered that the plantation would fail within a year, that the slaves would become unruly without a firm, masculine hand to guide them. But Margaret Ashford was not the fragile flower that polite society expected her to be. Born Margaret Whitmore, daughter of a prosperous merchant family, she had married into the Ashford lineage with a practical mind and an iron will carefully concealed beneath layers of silk and social propriety. When her husband died, she did not retreat to her father's house in Richmond as many expected. Instead, she remained at the plantation, determined to prove that a woman could succeed where men predicted only failure. Among the enslaved population of the Ashford plantation lived a boy known simply as Thomas. Born in 1838, he was the son of Sarah, the plantation's head cook, and bore no resemblance to any of the enslaved men on the property. His features were lighter than most, his hair softer, and his eyes held an intelligence that seemed to pierce through the careful boundaries that separated master from property. Sarah never spoke of his father, maintaining a silence so complete that even the other enslaved individuals stopped asking questions after the first few years. Thomas had been raised differently from the other children on the plantation. While boys his age were assigned to field work or stable duties, Thomas was brought into the main house at the age of 8. Colonel Ashford claimed the boy showed promise and could be trained for more refined duties, but those who paid attention noticed that Thomas received instruction in reading, writing, and arithmetic alongside the colonel's own nephew, who visited each summer. When Margaret became the sole authority on the plantation, Thomas was 18 years old, tall and lean with calloused hands that spoke of hard work, despite his privileged position among the enslaved population. He had been serving as the colonel's personal attendant in his final months, learning to manage correspondence, maintain records, and handle the delicate negotiations required to keep a struggling plantation afloat. Margaret found herself relying on his assistance more than propriety should have allowed. The arrangement began innocuously enough. Thomas would bring Margaret her morning correspondence and remain to discuss the day's business. He knew which fields needed attention, which enslaved individuals were struggling with their health, and which creditors required immediate payment to avoid scandal. In a world where white women were expected to remain ignorant of such practical matters, Margaret discovered that Thomas possessed knowledge that could save her from financial ruin. Local records from the Whitmore County Courthouse, preserved in a collection of documents discovered during renovations in 1962, reveal that Margaret began signing unusual papers in the spring of 1855. She filed formal requests to educate Thomas in advanced mathematics and land management, claiming he would serve as an overseer under her direct supervision. Such arrangements were not unheard of, though they required careful documentation to avoid accusations of illegally educating enslaved individuals beyond their prescribed roles. The community's suspicions were first recorded in a letter dated June 15, 1855, written by Reverend Cornelius Baxter to his brother in Charleston. The letter, found among the Reverend's papers when his estate was settled in 1964, described troubling observations about the Ashford plantation. Baxter wrote that Thomas had been seen dining at the main table, wearing clothing of fine quality and accompanying Margaret to business meetings in town. More disturbing still, neighbors reported that Thomas addressed Margaret by her first name when they believed themselves unobserved. By autumn of 1855, the whispers had grown into open speculation. Mrs. Abigail Thornton, wife of the neighboring plantation owner, documented her concerns in a diary that survived in her family's possession until it was donated to the Virginia Historical Society in 1959. She wrote that Margaret and Thomas had been observed walking together in the early morning hours, their conversation intimate and their proximity inappropriate for the relationship between mistress and property. Mrs. Thornton noted that Thomas no longer slept in the quarters with the other enslaved individuals, but had been given rooms in the main house, ostensibly to better serve his duties as personal attendant. The transformation was gradual, but unmistakable to those who chose to see it. Thomas began handling business correspondence without Margaret's presence, meeting with suppliers and creditors as though he possessed authority beyond his legal status. Local merchants, desperate for payment in increasingly difficult economic times, accepted his negotiations rather than risk losing their accounts entirely. A receipt dated November 23, 1855, shows Thomas's signature authorizing payment for winter supplies, signed not with the crude mark of an enslaved individual, but with the educated script of a man accustomed to conducting business. Winter brought isolation that proved both protective and dangerous for the unusual household. Snow fell heavily that year, cutting off the plantation from regular contact with neighbors and allowing Margaret and Thomas to live according to their own rules rather than society's expectations. When spring arrived and normal social interactions resumed, the changes were impossible to ignore. Thomas, now dressed as a gentleman, spoke with the confidence of someone accustomed to making decisions, and carried himself with the bearing of a man who expected respect rather than submission. The crisis that would define their relationship began with a simple business transaction gone wrong. In March of 1856, Margaret discovered that her late husband's brother, Edwin Ashford, had been systematically embezzling from the plantation's accounts. Edwin lived in Baltimore and served as the official executor of his brother's estate, a position that gave him access to funds that he had been redirecting to cover his own gambling debts. Margaret's discovery came through Thomas's meticulous review of the account ledgers, a task that revealed discrepancies totaling nearly $800. When Margaret confronted Edwin with evidence of his theft, he responded with threats that went far beyond financial intimidation. Edwin possessed knowledge of Margaret's unusual relationship with Thomas, information he had gathered through careful questioning of servants and business associates in Whitmore County. He promised to expose the relationship publicly unless Margaret agreed to sign over her rights to the plantation and relocate to a remote property in Western Virginia where her scandalous behavior could be contained. The situation required a solution that defied every legal and social convention of the antebellum South. Margaret could not marry Thomas legally, as Virginia law prohibited marriage between white and enslaved individuals. She could not free him without losing his services entirely, as freed slaves were required to leave Virginia within 1 year unless granted special permission to remain. Most importantly, she could not trust Edwin to honor any agreement that left him with access to the plantation's resources. Margaret's response was documented in a series of legal papers filed in Richmond during the spring of 1856, documents that remained sealed in the state archives until they were discovered during a routine cataloging project in 1967. She had quietly consulted with a lawyer who specialized in complex property arrangements, exploring options that might protect both her interests and Thomas's future. The lawyer, Jonathan Whitfield, noted in his private correspondence that Margaret's case presented legal challenges unlike any he had previously encountered. The solution they devised required careful timing and absolute secrecy. Margaret would travel to Philadelphia, where she possessed distant family connections and where Pennsylvania's laws regarding slavery differed significantly from Virginia's. She would establish legal residence there and file papers to manumit Thomas under Pennsylvania law, a process that would grant him immediate freedom without the residency restrictions imposed by Virginia. Once freed, Thomas could legally change his name and establish his own identity separate from his enslaved past. But the plan required more than simple manumission. Margaret intended to transfer ownership of the Virginia plantation to Thomas through a complex arrangement involving a series of shell companies and intermediate owners. The plantation would legally belong to Thomas, operated under his direction, while Margaret would remain as his wife in all but legal status. They would live as husband and wife on property that belonged to the man who had once been her slave. The execution of this plan began in May of 1856, when Margaret announced her intention to visit family in Philadelphia for an extended period. She explained to neighbors that the stress of managing the plantation alone had affected her health and that she required several months of rest and medical attention. Thomas would accompany her as personal attendant, a common arrangement for wealthy women traveling without male relatives for protection. What the neighbors did not know was that Margaret had already sold most of the plantation's livestock and equipment, converting the assets to gold and cash that could be easily transported. She had also quietly negotiated the sale of several enslaved individuals to a plantation in North Carolina, claiming financial difficulties required her to reduce the size of the operation. Only a dozen enslaved individuals remained on the property, those whose skills were essential for basic agricultural operations. The journey to Philadelphia in late May of 1856 was documented in Margaret's personal journal, a leather-bound book discovered in the attic of a Philadelphia boarding house during demolition work in 1963. Her entries revealed the emotional complexity of their situation as they traveled together, no longer bound by the master-slave relationship, but not yet free to openly acknowledge their true feelings for each other. Margaret wrote that Thomas struggled with the transition, unsure of how to behave when the legal constraints that had defined his entire existence suddenly disappeared. In Philadelphia, Margaret rented rooms in a boarding house operated by a Quaker family known for their abolitionist sympathies. The owners, Samuel and Rebecca Morrison, asked no uncomfortable questions about the relationship between the refined Southern woman and the well-dressed man who accompanied her. Pennsylvania's more liberal attitudes toward freed slaves provided cover for arrangements that would have caused scandal in Virginia. The legal proceedings in Philadelphia took nearly 2 months to complete. Thomas, now legally freed, chose the name Thomas Whitmore, adopting Margaret's maiden name as a symbol of their new relationship. He filed papers to purchase property in Virginia through a series of intermediary transactions designed to obscure his identity and his connection to Margaret. The Ashford plantation would be sold to a company owned by Thomas Whitmore, a free man of color with sufficient resources to manage agricultural operations. While the legal arrangements proceeded, Margaret and Thomas lived as husband and wife in their Philadelphia boarding house. Rebecca Morrison later recalled, in an interview conducted by a member of the Underground Railroad Historical Association in 1958, that the couple seemed deeply devoted to each other, but carried themselves with the caution of people accustomed to hiding their true feelings. Margaret never removed her wedding ring from her first marriage, wearing it as protection against questions about her status as a single woman traveling with a male companion. The return to Virginia in August of 1856 marked the beginning of the most dangerous phase of their plan. Margaret arrived first, explaining to neighbors that her health had improved dramatically during her stay in Philadelphia, but that she had decided to sell the plantation to a businessman from Pennsylvania who intended to experiment with new agricultural techniques. Thomas arrived 2 weeks later, introducing himself to the community as T. Whitmore, the new owner of the former Ashford property. The deception required perfect execution of roles they had rehearsed for months. In public, Margaret treated Thomas with the formal respect due to an employer, addressing him as Mr. Whitmore, and deferring to his decisions regarding the management of the property. Thomas, in turn, treated Margaret with the careful courtesy appropriate for a widowed woman serving as his housekeeper and estate manager. To the casual observer, the arrangement appeared to be a practical business relationship between a northern businessman and a southern woman with local knowledge. But the closest neighbors soon noticed details that suggested a more complex relationship. The enslaved individuals who remained on the property treated both Margaret and Thomas with the careful deference typically reserved for masters, suggesting that they understood the true nature of the arrangement. More tellingly, Thomas demonstrated knowledge of the plantation's operations that would have been impossible for a northern businessman to acquire during brief visits. He knew which fields produced the best yields, which enslaved individuals possessed specialized skills, and which local merchants offered the most favorable terms for supplies. Edwin Ashford's return from Baltimore in September of 1856 created the crisis that Margaret and Thomas had been anticipating. Edwin expected to find his sister-in-law struggling with financial difficulties, prepared to accept his terms for resolving the plantation's problems. Instead, he discovered that the property had been sold to an unknown buyer and that Margaret appeared to be thriving under the new arrangement. Edwin's investigation into the sale revealed irregularities that aroused his suspicions. The purchasing company existed only on paper, with no verifiable business history or physical location. The financing for the purchase had come from sources that could not be traced through normal banking channels. Most disturbing of all, the new owner bore a striking resemblance to the enslaved individual who had served as Margaret's personal attendant. When Edwin confronted Margaret with his suspicions, she maintained the fiction that Thomas was simply her employer, a businessman from Pennsylvania who had purchased the plantation as an investment property. But Edwin possessed enough knowledge of Virginia law to understand that the arrangement was impossible without fraudulent documentation. No bank would have provided financing to a recently freed slave for such a large purchase, and no legitimate business would have operated through the complex network of intermediary companies that had facilitated the transaction. Edwin's threats escalated quickly from financial blackmail to promises of legal action and public exposure. He threatened to file complaints with both Virginia and Pennsylvania authorities, alleging fraud in the manumission proceedings and conspiracy to violate Virginia's laws regarding slave education and property ownership. More dangerously, he threatened to reveal the true nature of Margaret and Thomas's relationship, accusations that could result in charges of adultery and cohabitation across racial lines. The solution to Edwin's threats came from an unexpected source. Samuel Morrison, the Quaker boarding house owner from Philadelphia, had maintained correspondence with Margaret following her return to Virginia. When Margaret described Edwin's blackmail attempts in a letter dated October 12, 1856, Morrison responded with information that shifted the balance of power dramatically. Through his connections in the abolitionist movement, Morrison had learned that Edwin Ashford was involved in illegal activities that went far beyond embezzlement from his brother's estate. Morrison's letter, preserved in the Morrison family papers donated to Haverford College in 1959, revealed that Edwin had been selling information about Underground Railroad activities to slave catchers operating in Maryland and Pennsylvania. His gambling debts had made him vulnerable to recruitment by individuals who paid well for intelligence about escaped slaves and their allies. Several successful raids on safe houses had been traced to information that could only have come from someone with access to abolitionist networks in Baltimore. Armed with this information, Margaret and Thomas were able to turn Edwin's blackmail attempt against him. When Edwin arrived at the plantation in November of 1856 for what he intended to be a final confrontation, he found himself facing accusations that carried far more serious consequences than the irregularities he had discovered in the plantation sale. Margaret presented him with detailed documentation of his activities as an informant, information that could not only destroy his reputation, but potentially result in criminal charges for conspiracy and accessory to kidnapping. The meeting took place in the plantation study, a room lined with law books and plantation records that had witnessed decades of business transactions and family decisions. Margaret sat behind the massive oak desk that had belonged to her late husband, while Thomas stood near the window, his presence both protective and symbolic of the power shift that had occurred. Edwin found himself in the position of a supplicant rather than a blackmailer, forced to negotiate for his own protection rather than demanding concessions from his supposed victims. The agreement they reached was documented in papers that were sealed and deposited with a lawyer in Richmond, with instructions that they not be opened unless one of the parties died or disappeared under suspicious circumstances. Edwin would abandon all claims to the plantation and cease his investigation into Margaret and Thomas's arrangement. In return, Margaret would not reveal Edwin's activities to abolitionist organizations or federal authorities investigating slave-catching operations. But the agreement came with additional terms that ensured Edwin's continued silence. He would relocate to California, far from Virginia's social networks and the temptation to resume his gambling and informant activities. Margaret provided him with sufficient funds to establish himself in San Francisco, money that came with the understanding that any future contact with Virginia would result in immediate exposure of his past activities. Edwin's departure in December of 1856 marked the beginning of a new phase in Margaret and Thomas's unusual relationship. With the immediate threat of exposure removed, they were able to settle into the domestic life they had carefully constructed. Margaret resumed her role as the plantation's manager, handling correspondence and social obligations with neighboring families, while Thomas focused on agricultural operations and business development. The success of their deception depended on maintaining careful boundaries in public while allowing their true relationship to flourish in private. Margaret continued to live in the main house, while Thomas occupied rooms that had originally belonged to the overseer, an arrangement that provided both proximity and plausible deniability. They took their meals together in the privacy of Margaret's study, but Thomas joined the enslaved individuals for dinner when visitors were present. The enslaved population of the plantation adapted to the new arrangement with the pragmatic acceptance of people accustomed to changes in their circumstances. They understood that their survival depended on maintaining the fiction that Thomas was their owner, rather than someone who had once shared their bondage. Sarah, Thomas's mother, continued to serve as head cook, but now answered to a son who legally possessed the power of life and death over her. This domestic arrangement created psychological tensions that neither Margaret nor Thomas had fully anticipated. Thomas struggled with the guilt of owning his own mother and former companions, even though he treated them with far more humanity than most slaveholders of the era. Margaret found herself isolated from the white social community that had once provided friendship and support, unable to share the truth of her circumstances with anyone beyond the plantation's boundaries. The winter of 1856 to 1857 brought both relief and new challenges for the unconventional household. Snow and cold weather reduced social interactions with neighbors, allowing Margaret and Thomas to live more openly as husband and wife within their own home. But the isolation also intensified the psychological pressure of maintaining their elaborate deception, creating stress that manifested in unexpected ways. Margaret began experiencing episodes of anxiety and depression that she attributed to the strain of constant vigilance. Her journal entries from this period, discovered among papers in the Richmond lawyer's office in 1961, reveal a woman struggling to balance love and practicality, freedom and social expectations. She wrote of dreams where she and Thomas lived openly as husband and wife, in a place where their love was not constrained by laws and prejudices, but also nightmares where their deception was exposed and Thomas was returned to slavery or worse. Thomas's adjustment to his new role proved equally difficult. Having been raised in slavery, he possessed intimate knowledge of the psychological damage that the institution inflicted on both enslaved individuals and their owners. Now, as a legal owner of human property himself, he experienced the moral corruption that came with absolute power over other human beings, even when that power was exercised with compassion and restraint. The contradiction of his position became most apparent in his interactions with his mother, Sarah. In private, they maintained the loving relationship of mother and son, sharing memories of his childhood and discussing their hopes for the future. But in public, particularly when neighbors or business associates visited the plantation, Thomas was forced to treat Sarah as property, giving orders and expecting immediate compliance in ways that violated every instinct he possessed. Spring of 1857 brought new complications as the agricultural season required increased interaction with neighboring planters and local merchants. Thomas's inexperience with the social rituals of white plantation ownership became increasingly apparent to those who dealt with him regularly. He lacked the casual brutality that characterized most slaveholders' treatment of their property, a deficiency that raised questions among men accustomed to maintaining their authority through fear and violence. Local merchant records from this period, preserved in the Whitmore County Historical Society archives, show that Thomas consistently paid higher wages to free laborers and purchased better quality food and clothing for the enslaved individuals on his plantation. While such generosity might have been attributed to northern sensibilities or religious conviction, the pattern was unusual enough to attract attention from men whose own profits depended on maintaining lower standards for slave welfare. The situation reached a critical point in June of 1857, when Thomas was invited to join a consortium of local planters planning to purchase a large tract of land for development. The invitation represented both an opportunity for social acceptance and a dangerous test of his ability to maintain his cover identity. Participation would require him to contribute several $1,000s to the venture, while demonstrating the kind of business acumen expected of successful plantation owners. Margaret's counsel during this crisis revealed the depth of her transformation from sheltered Southern belle to shrewd businesswoman. She advised Thomas to accept the invitation, but to insist on reviewing all documents and financial projections before committing funds to the project. This approach would buy time for them to investigate the other participants, while demonstrating the careful business practices that might be expected from a northern investor. The consortium meetings took place in the offices of Whitmore County's most prominent lawyer, a location that provided both legitimacy and risk for Thomas's continued deception. Among the other participants was Colonel Henry Rutledge, owner of the county's largest plantation, and a man known for his ability to detect weakness or deception in business negotiations. Rutledge had built his fortune through careful observation of human nature and was unlikely to accept Thomas at face value. Thomas's performance during these meetings was documented in notes kept by the lawyer's clerk, a meticulous record keeper whose observations were preserved when the law office was dissolved in 1964. The clerk noted that Thomas demonstrated unusual knowledge of agricultural techniques and labor management, suggesting practical experience that went beyond theoretical education. More significantly, Thomas showed sympathy for the welfare of enslaved workers that was inconsistent with the profit-maximizing mindset typical of successful plantation owners. Colonel Rutledge's suspicions were confirmed when he conducted a discreet investigation into Thomas's background and business history. Through contacts in Pennsylvania and Baltimore, Rutledge discovered that T. Whitmore had no verifiable existence prior to his arrival in Virginia. The companies that had supposedly financed his plantation purchase existed only as legal entities with no physical offices or business operations. Most damaging of all, several witnesses in Philadelphia remembered seeing Thomas in the company of Margaret Ashford during her extended visit to the city. Rather than expose Thomas immediately, Colonel Rutledge chose to use his knowledge as leverage for his own benefit. He approached Thomas privately with a proposition that would test the limits of their carefully constructed deception. Rutledge offered to remain silent about his discoveries in exchange for Thomas's participation in a venture that would require him to act against his own moral principles. The proposition involved the purchase and transportation of a large group of enslaved individuals from a failing plantation in North Carolina. Rutledge had identified an opportunity to acquire nearly 50 enslaved workers at below-market prices, due to the original owner's financial distress. The venture promised substantial profits for the consortium members, but it also required each participant to demonstrate their commitment to the expansion of slavery rather than its gradual elimination. For Thomas, participation in such a venture represented the ultimate moral compromise. He would be required to purchase human beings with the explicit intention of profiting from their forced labor, becoming fully complicit in the system that had once held him in bondage. Refusal to participate, however, would almost certainly result in exposure of his true identity and the destruction of everything he and Margaret had built together. Margaret's response to this crisis revealed the extent to which their relationship had transformed her own moral framework. Rather than counseling Thomas to abandon their deception and flee to the north, she proposed a more aggressive strategy that would neutralize Rutledge's threat while protecting their position in the community. She suggested that they accept Rutledge's proposition but modify the terms in ways that would serve their own interests rather than his. The plan Margaret developed required them to outmaneuver Rutledge using his own methods against him. Through her contacts in Richmond's financial community, Margaret arranged for the consortium to secure financing for the North Carolina purchase through a bank that specialized in agricultural investments. However, the loan documents included clauses that would transfer ownership of the purchased enslaved individuals to Thomas alone if any member of the consortium defaulted on their financial obligations. Margaret then used information from Edwin Ashford's abandoned papers to manipulate market conditions in ways that would force several consortium members into financial difficulty. Edwin's gambling debts had been financed through loans secured by agricultural commodities, and his creditors were prepared to call in those debts at the most disadvantageous possible moment. When commodity prices dropped suddenly in late summer of 1857, 3 consortium members found themselves unable to meet their obligations. The collapse of the consortium left Thomas as the sole owner of 47 enslaved individuals purchased from the North Carolina plantation, a situation that required immediate resolution to avoid financial disaster. Margaret's solution demonstrated the cold pragmatism that their circumstances had forced upon her. Rather than attempting to free the newly acquired individuals immediately, she proposed to use them as leverage for negotiating their way out of Virginia entirely. Through contacts in the abolitionist movement, Margaret arranged for the purchase of the 47 enslaved individuals by an organization dedicated to settling freed slaves in Liberia. The transaction would provide Thomas with sufficient funds to liquidate his Virginia holdings while ensuring that the purchased individuals would ultimately gain their freedom in West Africa rather than remaining in permanent bondage. But the Liberia project required several months to arrange proper transportation and documentation, leaving Thomas responsible for the welfare of 47 additional human beings during the interim period. The enslaved individuals were temporarily housed in barracks, constructed on a remote section of the plantation, far from the main house and the regular quarters occupied by the original enslaved population. The presence of so many additional people on the plantation created logistical challenges that strained the resources and secrecy that Margaret and Thomas had carefully maintained. Food costs increased dramatically, requiring additional purchases that attracted attention from local suppliers. The enlarged enslaved population required closer supervision, necessitating the hiring of additional overseers who might observe irregularities in Thomas's management style. More significantly, the newly acquired enslaved individuals brought with them stories and experiences from their previous plantation that highlighted the contradictions in Thomas's position. Several of the newcomers had been subjected to severe physical punishment and sexual exploitation by their former owners, experiences that they naturally expected to continue under their new master. When Thomas refused to continue such practices, word spread quickly through both the newcomer and original enslaved populations. The psychological impact of managing so many enslaved individuals began to manifest in Thomas's behavior during the autumn of 1857. Margaret's journal entries from this period describe a man struggling with depression and what would today be recognized as symptoms of post-traumatic stress. Thomas began experiencing nightmares where he was returned to slavery himself. He forced to endure the same brutalities that he now had the power to inflict upon others. Sarah, his mother, became increasingly concerned about her son's mental state as he withdrew from normal social interactions and spent long hours alone in the fields or barns. Her position as head cook provided her with opportunities to observe both Thomas and Margaret during their private moments together, and she documented her concerns in a series of letters to her sister, who lived as a free woman in Philadelphia. These letters, discovered among the papers of the Philadelphia Abolition Society in 1966, provide a unique perspective on the household dynamics during this critical period. Sarah wrote that Thomas had begun to treat Margaret with a formality and distance that contrasted sharply with their earlier intimacy, as though the burden of slave ownership had created barriers between them that neither could openly acknowledge. The crisis reached its peak in December of 1857, when one of the newly acquired enslaved individuals, a young woman named Hannah, attempted to escape from the plantation. Hannah had been sexually abused by her previous owner and feared that Thomas intended to continue such treatment despite his earlier reassurances. Her escape attempt was discovered by one of the hired overseers, who brought her back to the plantation expecting Thomas to order the severe punishment that such defiance typically warranted. Thomas's refusal to authorize physical punishment for Hannah created a confrontation that threatened to expose the entire deception he and Margaret had constructed. The overseer, a local man named Jonas Crow, who had been hired for his reputation as an effective disciplinarian, argued that lenient treatment would encourage other escape attempts and undermine the authority necessary to maintain order among the enslaved population. But Thomas's response revealed how completely his perspective had been transformed by his experiences as both enslaved individual and reluctant owner. Rather than ordering punishment, he spent several hours in private conversation with Hannah, learning about her fears and attempting to reassure her about her future prospects. When she remained unconvinced, Thomas made a decision that violated every principle of plantation management but reflected his own moral convictions. He provided Hannah with detailed information about the planned sale to the Liberia organization, including documentation that proved she would be freed upon arrival in West Africa rather than sold into continued bondage. More significantly, he offered her the option of immediate escape to Pennsylvania, providing her with sufficient funds and contacts to reach safety among Philadelphia's free black community. Hannah's choice to remain on the plantation and await transportation to Liberia rather than attempting an immediately escape provided Thomas with a solution to his dilemma with the overseer Jonas Crow. He was able to present Hannah's compliance as evidence that firm but fair treatment was more effective than brutality for maintaining discipline among enslaved workers. Crow remained skeptical but could not argue with results that maintained order without resorting to violence. The Hannah incident marked a turning point in Thomas's approach to managing the enslaved population under his legal control. Rather than attempting to maintain the facade of conventional slave ownership, he began gradually preparing all 47 individuals for their eventual transportation to Liberia. This preparation included basic education in reading and writing, instruction in agricultural techniques that would be useful in West Africa, and discussions about what they could expect in their new homeland. Margaret's role in this educational project demonstrated how far her own transformation had progressed since her days as a conventional Southern plantation mistress. She organized formal lessons for the enslaved women, teaching them domestic skills that would be valuable in establishing households in Liberia, while also providing instruction in basic literacy and numeracy that was illegal under Virginia law, but essential for their success as free individuals. The educational activities required absolute secrecy from the local white community, which viewed any attempt to educate enslaved individuals as a direct threat to the social order that maintained white supremacy. Margaret and Thomas established the lessons in an abandoned tobacco barn on a remote section of the plantation, scheduling sessions during hours when neighboring planters were least likely to conduct casual visits. The winter of 1857 to 1858 brought news that would accelerate their timetable for leaving Virginia. The Liberia organization informed them that transportation had been arranged for March of 1858, earlier than originally anticipated, but welcome news for a household struggling under the psychological burden of maintaining their deception while managing such a large enslaved population. But the early departure date created new challenges for liquidating Thomas's holdings and establishing their future lives outside of Virginia. The plantation itself could not be sold quickly without arousing suspicion about Thomas's reasons for leaving the county so abruptly. Agricultural equipment and livestock required time to find buyers willing to pay fair prices rather than taking advantage of a seller's apparent desperation. Margaret's solution involved a carefully orchestrated series of transactions designed to maximize their resources while maintaining the appearance of normal business operations. She arranged for the plantation to be leased to Colonel Rutledge for a 3-year period, with an option for him to purchase the property if Thomas decided not to return to Virginia. This arrangement provided immediate income while avoiding the complications of an outright sale. The livestock and equipment were sold through a series of smaller transactions conducted over several weeks, each one appearing to be a routine adjustment to the plantation's operations rather than evidence of a complete liquidation. Margaret's knowledge of local merchant networks, gained through years of managing household purchases, proved invaluable for identifying buyers who would pay fair prices without asking uncomfortable questions about the seller's motivations. The personal belongings accumulated during Margaret's years as a plantation mistress required more delicate handling. Many items possessed sentimental value that made their abandonment emotionally difficult, while others represented wealth that could be converted to cash for their uncertain future. Margaret's jewellery, inherited from her mother and augmented during her marriage to Colonel Ashford, could be sold in Richmond without attracting attention to their departure plans, but other possessions carried emotional weight that made their disposal more complex. The library of books that had educated Thomas during his years as personal attendant to Colonel Ashford represented knowledge and culture that both he and Margaret were reluctant to abandon. The portrait of Colonel Ashford that hung in the main parlour served as a reminder of the conventional life that Margaret was choosing to abandon for an uncertain future with a man society viewed as unsuitable for marriage. In February of 1858, Margaret made the final preparations for their departure by arranging for letters to be sent to her family in Richmond and Norfolk. These letters, carefully worded to avoid arousing suspicion, explained that she had decided to accompany T. Whitmore on an extended business trip to evaluate investment opportunities in the Western Territories. The arrangement would allow her to serve as his agent for establishing agricultural operations in areas where her knowledge of southern farming techniques would prove valuable. The letters also mentioned that she might remain in the West permanently if the opportunities proved sufficiently promising, a statement that provided cover for her permanent disappearance from Virginia society without suggesting anything improper about her relationship with Thomas. Family members who received these letters later recalled that Margaret had seemed restless and dissatisfied with plantation life since her husband's death, making her decision to seek new opportunities appear reasonable rather than scandalous. Thomas's final weeks as a Virginia plantation owner were marked by the completion of educational projects that he hoped would benefit the enslaved individuals remaining under his legal ownership. In addition to the 47 individuals destined for Liberia, 12 enslaved workers would remain on the plantation under Colonel Rutledge's management. Thomas wanted to provide these individuals with skills and knowledge that might improve their lives even under continued bondage. The educational sessions in the tobacco barn expanded to include practical training in carpentry, metalworking, and other skilled trades that would make the remaining enslaved individuals more valuable to their future owner. Thomas reasoned that increased value would lead to better treatment, as Rutledge would have financial incentives to protect his investment in skilled workers rather than treating them as expendable field hands. Sarah, Thomas's mother, faced the most difficult decision of all. At 60 years of age, she was offered the choice of accompanying the Liberia-bound group to freedom in West Africa or remaining on the plantation where she had spent her entire life. The decision required her to weigh the certainty of familiar bondage against the uncertainty of freedom in a foreign land where she possessed no connections or cultural knowledge. Her choice to remain in Virginia reflected the complex calculations that enslaved individuals were forced to make when confronted with opportunities for freedom. Sarah understood that her advanced age would make the physical demands of establishing a new life in Liberia extremely challenging, possibly impossible. She also possessed valuable skills as a cook and healer that made her valuable to any plantation owner, ensuring better treatment than field workers typically received. But Sarah's decision also reflected her desire to maintain some connection to her son's heritage in the land where he had been born and raised. She negotiated an agreement with Thomas that would allow her to correspond with him through intermediaries, maintaining family ties despite the vast distances that would separate them. This arrangement violated the normal expectations that enslaved individuals would have no contact with the outside world, but Colonel Rutledge agreed to the special provision as part of his lease arrangement. The departure from Virginia took place on a cold morning in March of 1858, with 47 individuals boarding wagons that would transport them to Norfolk for the beginning of their journey to Liberia. Margaret and Thomas accompanied the group to ensure that transportation arrangements proceeded smoothly and to provide final reassurances to individuals who remained fearful about their ultimate destinations. The scene at the plantation that morning was documented by Jonas Crow, the overseer who had been retained to manage the transition to Colonel Rutledge's authority. Crow's account, recorded in a letter to his brother and preserved in family papers donated to the Virginia Historical Society in 1965, described the unusual emotional atmosphere that surrounded the departure. Rather than the sullen resignation typical of enslaved individuals being transported to unknown destinations, Crow observed what appeared to be a farewell gathering among family members preparing for a long separation. The 47 individuals embraced Margaret and Thomas with affection rather than fear, suggesting relationships that transcended the normal boundaries between masters and property. Most remarkably, Crow noted that several of the departing individuals addressed Thomas by his first name, a breach of protocol so severe that it would normally result in immediate punishment. When Crow mentioned this observation to Thomas, expecting orders to correct such insubordination, Thomas simply replied that different standards would apply to individuals who were leaving Virginia permanently. The journey to Norfolk required 2 days of careful travel along roads that were monitored by slave patrols and local authorities suspicious of large groups of enslaved individuals moving without obvious commercial purpose. Margaret and Thomas carried extensive documentation proving their legal right to transport the 47 individuals, but they also understood that bureaucratic paperwork provided limited protection against officials who might be bribed to create complications. The ship that would carry the group to Liberia was operated by the American Colonization Society, an organization dedicated to establishing settlements of freed American slaves in West Africa. The captain, Ezra Thompson, had transported hundreds of freed individuals to Liberia over the previous decade and was accustomed to the complex emotions that surrounded such departures. His records, preserved in the Society's archives, noted that the March 1858 group was unusual for the evident preparation and education that the individuals had received. Margaret's farewell to the 47 individuals she had helped prepare for freedom marked the end of her identity as a Virginia plantation mistress and the beginning of an uncertain future as the wife of a man who existed legally only through carefully constructed documentation. Her journal entry from that evening, written in a Norfolk boarding house, expressed both relief and terror about the life she was choosing to embrace. Thomas's transformation was even more profound. In the space of less than 2 years, he had experienced slavery, freedom, slave ownership, and now exile from the only home he had ever known. The psychological burden of these transitions manifested in physical symptoms that concerned Margaret as they prepared to travel westward toward territories where their relationship might be accepted with less scrutiny. Their departure from Norfolk in April of 1858 was witnessed by few people, as they had deliberately chosen to travel during a period when most passengers would be merchants and other individuals, with little interest in the personal affairs of fellow travelers. Margaret had adopted the identity of Mrs. Thomas Whitmore, a role that felt both natural and strange after years of maintaining elaborate deceptions about their true relationship. The westward journey took them through Tennessee and Kentucky, states where slavery remained legal, but where the social structures were less rigid than in the established plantation regions of Virginia. Thomas's identity as a free man of color with sufficient resources to travel in comfort attracted occasional attention, but the presence of Margaret as his apparent wife provided social protection that would have been impossible in the communities they had left behind. Their destination was California, a state where the gold rush had created social upheaval that made unconventional relationships easier to establish and maintain. Thomas had researched opportunities in agricultural development around the growing city of Sacramento, where his knowledge of farming techniques could be applied to crops that differed significantly from the tobacco and cotton that had dominated Virginia agriculture. The establishment of their new life in California proceeded more smoothly than either had dared hope. Thomas purchased land in the Sacramento Valley and began developing a farm that specialized in vegetables and grains for the growing urban population. Margaret's skills in managing household affairs and maintaining business records proved invaluable for establishing their operation as a profitable enterprise. But their success came at the cost of complete separation from their previous lives and identities. Margaret never again corresponded with her family in Virginia, allowing them to believe that she had died during her travels in the Western Territories. Thomas maintained contact with his mother Sarah only through a complex network of intermediaries that protected both of them from exposure. The letters that Sarah sent through this network, discovered among papers in a Philadelphia abolitionist's estate in 1964, revealed that she remained on the Virginia plantation until her death in 1866. Colonel Rutledge honored his agreement to allow her correspondence privileges, though he never learned the true identity of her distant correspondents. Sarah's final letter, dated November 1866, informed Thomas that Edwin Ashford had been killed in a San Francisco gambling house, shot by creditors who had grown tired of his broken promises to repay substantial debts. Edwin's death removed the last person who possessed detailed knowledge of the deception that had allowed Thomas and Margaret to escape their previous lives and establish themselves as husband and wife in California. Margaret died in 1879, 23 years after their departure from Virginia. Her death certificate, filed in Sacramento County, listed her as the wife of Thomas Whitmore, farmer, with no mention of her previous marriage or her origins in Virginia Plantation Society. Thomas survived her by 6 years, dying in 1885 as a respected member of the Sacramento agricultural community. The farm they had built together was inherited by a nephew of Margaret's, who had been told only that she had married a successful California farmer after her first husband's death. The nephew sold the property to developers who were unaware of the remarkable story that lay behind its establishment. The proceeds from the sale funded a scholarship at a newly established college for Negro students, a final gesture that honored the 47 individuals whose freedom had made possible Thomas and Margaret's escape to a new life. Records of their California years, preserved in the Sacramento Historical Society archives, show that Thomas and Margaret lived quietly but comfortably, participating in local social activities and contributing to charitable causes without attracting the kind of attention that might have led to uncomfortable questions about their past. They were remembered by neighbors as a devoted couple who seemed to understand the value of the peaceful life they had created together. The truth about their origins remained hidden until 1968. When a researcher investigating Underground Railroad activities discovered Sarah's letters among abolitionist papers being donated to a historical archive. The letters led to further investigation that gradually uncovered the elaborate deception that had allowed a Virginia slave and his mistress to become husband and wife in California. The researchers' findings were published in a limited academic journal that attracted little public attention, ensuring that Thomas and Margaret's story remained known only to a small community of scholars interested in the complexities of antebellum Southern society. The plantation where their story began had been abandoned during the Civil War, and later subdivided for small farms worked by freed slaves who had no knowledge of its unusual history. The 47 individuals who had traveled to Liberia established a small but prosperous community in West Africa, with several eventually returning to the United States as missionaries and educators. Their descendants retained oral traditions about the Virginia plantation owner who had treated them with unusual kindness and prepared them for freedom, but they never learned the truth about Thomas's own enslaved origins. Today, the only physical remnant of Margaret and Thomas's Virginia life is the abandoned foundation of the tobacco barn, where they conducted secret educational sessions for the enslaved individuals under their care. The foundation lies overgrown with vines and surrounded by trees that have reclaimed the fields where Thomas once worked as both slave and master. The remarkable transformation of their relationship from master and slave to husband and wife challenges conventional understanding of both love and power in antebellum American society. Their story demonstrates the lengths to which individuals will go to protect relationships that society deems impossible, and the courage required to abandon everything familiar for the possibility of authentic love. But their story also reveals the moral compromises that even well-intentioned individuals were forced to make within the constraints of a society built on human bondage. Thomas's brief period as a slave owner, however reluctant and temporary, illustrates the corrupting influence of institutional slavery on everyone it touched, regardless of their personal convictions or experiences. The documents that preserve their story remain scattered across archives in Virginia, Pennsylvania, and California, waiting for researchers who might piece together other fragments of their remarkable deception. Some questions about their relationship may never be answered, as they were careful to destroy evidence that might have exposed their secret during their lifetimes. What emerges clearly from the available records is a love story that transcended the legal and social boundaries of its time, sustained by intelligence, courage, and the determination of two individuals to create a life together despite seemingly impossible obstacles. In a society that denied the humanity of enslaved individuals and severely constrained the freedom of women, Margaret and Thomas found a way to claim both love and liberty for themselves. Their legacy lies not in monuments or public recognition, but in the quiet courage they demonstrated in choosing each other over the safety of conventional social arrangements. In an age when love across racial lines was not merely forbidden, but criminalized, they proved that human affection could triumph over the artificial divisions that society imposed on intimate relationships. The silence that surrounds their California years suggests a couple who understood that their greatest victory lay not in public vindication of their choices, but in the simple achievement of growing old together as husband and wife. In a world that had sought to define them as master and property, they had succeeded in becoming simply two people who had found in each other the love that made exile from everything familiar seem worthwhile. And perhaps that quiet triumph, invisible to the society that had sought to prevent it, represents the most profound victory possible against the forces that conspire to keep human hearts apart. In choosing love over law, freedom over security, and each other over everything else, Margaret and Thomas achieved what few couples of any era managed to find: a relationship built on mutual choice rather than social expectation, sustained by shared sacrifice rather than convenient convention. The morning mist that still rises from the Sacramento Valley, where they lived their final years, carries no memory of their struggles or their secrets. But somewhere in the archives and record offices of 3 states, their story waits to remind us that love, when it is true enough and strong enough, can find a way to survive even the most determined efforts to destroy it.